Now, my subject is ancient Chinese thoughts on translation. And one of the features that are striking in this connection is that translation became truly important when Buddhism was transmitted to China. And at that time, a movement arose that is most nicely summarized by Vladimir Nabokov when he says, if it doesn't sound like a translation, it is treason. The Chinese felt it was treason to write about Buddhism in a kind of Chinese that didn't sound outlandish. So it is, in fact, not so strange when you think about it, because writing in Chinese would be to suggest that somehow this supreme truth from the far west was indigenous to the Central East. And of course it was felt not to be that. And so, very much like in modern China, in academic Chinese, it is obligatory to write as if you had a hard time doing so, because your thoughts must be informed by the fact that the truth remains in the far west, and now it is even further west, on the east coast of the United States, to be more precise. And so, modern academic Chinese is painfully Americanized Chinese in much the same manner that ancient Buddhist Chinese was trying to be exotic, trying to sound as if it was painfully inadequate to use standard Chinese to say things about Buddhism. So modern academic Chinese is, in a way, very much like a great deal of modern academic Malay, for example, and many other such languages. And we have the same effect, I'm claiming, in ancient China. People were proud of not being able to find the right word. So then, one thing that I find is absolutely central about Buddhist translation as compared to Western translation is the question of who you are writing for. Do these people that you are writing for have access to the original, or don't they? So translation in China is very simply for monolinguals only. The number of people who currently read Sanskrit and read the translation was statistically negligible. We know their names. We can count them not on a clenched fist, but on an open hand. So, translation for bilinguals and monolinguals with very limited access to the original was what was typical of Hellenistic Europe. And the reasons for the limited access we need not discuss, but I think we should, when we talk about translation, talk about the history of physical books. What books people physically would have access to is very interesting to know about. And translation for bilinguals with limited access to the original was in Rome. And in fact, the access was not so limited, and here the history of public libraries is very important. Access to the library, which was huge in China, was limited to a very small group of people who had imperial permission. And so finally there is translation for bilinguals with general access to the original, the post-Gutenberg Europe situation, which we tend to take to be the normal one, but which is actually a very marginal one in the history of translation, if you don't mind me saying so. So, in fact, what we have to imagine is a situation which is very much in number one. And we will hear more about it. Under these circumstances, what are the meanings that are relevant in Buddhist translation? One is the author's meaning of the original Indian text, to which we don't have access. But the received meaning in the Indian tradition is one that the commentaries do give us access to. And so that is to be distinguished from the translator's reading, which very often differs from the traditional meaning of the Indian text for reasons that have to do with his doctrinal bias and so on. So we are not, in fact, having dealing with a translator whose reading of the text he translates necessarily represents the meaning that is standard in India, if there is such a thing. And then we know from the reports that they make that a translator decides beforehand what to neglect, what he cannot hope to bring across. This is very obviously so if you translate from Greek, for example. You give up on the aorist and the different tenses, and so on and so on. And this is very important also conceptually. What the translator managed to make explicit then is another level of meaning. But what can be demonstrated to have managed to actually conveyed to the initiate Buddhist specialists, to the general Buddhist public, and then to the general literate public is a very different story. And what I'm saying, essentially, since many of you probably have it like I have it, that after 10 minutes of a talk one sort of tends to fade and not listen anymore, the story is basically that when we translate Chinese translations, we pretend to go for the received meaning in the Indian tradition which we read into the Chinese text constantly. And that is very unhistorical. So problems in translating Chinese translations into English then have to do with this problem that one assumes the translators were trying to convey something, which is what one reconstructs as the Indian meaning, whereas this is historically completely mistaken, and we can prove it. I want to understand that Eigenleben, which I look up. I had to look it up in a German-English dictionary. You see, it is independent existence of Buddhism within the Chinese cultural sphere, inspired by that conceptual impact from the far West. And it's exactly like studying Luther. I propose that it isn't a very good idea to do as all the scholars nearly that I know doing Chinese translations of Buddhist texts do. They do what you would do to Luther if you were satisfied once you had identified the Greek words he was trying to translate. That would be bizarre, and it tells you nothing about what is so exciting about Luther's reception of the New Testament and the Old Testament. So one thing is you have to realize that he rarely looked at the Greek, which I do know because I have studied the matter, and he looked at the Latin and he mistranslated the Latin deliberately in many points and so on. And it is all... When I say deliberately, of course, he knew very well that the angel said to Mary actually, "Hi," but he didn't really feel that was appropriate. So in his Sendbrief über das Dolmetschen, he said he preferred to mistranslate. So We have the translator's understanding of the Indian text, and then the translator one's translation into a Central Asian language, for which there are semi-bilingual Chinese translators. Then we have the second translators rendering this literal translation into pidgin Chinese, and we have the Chinese translator rendering this into basic literary Chinese, and we have the senior paid individual who actually produced the print. This is the least we have, and if we go long enough into this lecture, we will see that we have a great deal more administration during the period when translation of Buddhist texts was in fact industrialized, which happened in the 7th century AD on a very large scale. Yes?
This is the least, this is about the shortest hierarchical list?
Yes, and we have another one that is twice as long.
In other words, there are no direct translations from Sanskrit?
No, and it is as if you have a process which is like somebody whispers to somebody else, he whispers to somebody else, whispers to somebody else, and then you, the 14th recipient writes it down. And that is the situation, which I think is important to keep in mind, because it is just slightly different from Meister Eckhart translating Latin into Middle German or something like that. So in Europe, this is not an adequate description of what translation involves. In China, it is very much the standard thing we have to imagine. So then we have this other problem. I'm sorry, there are a lot of problems and few solutions. But this notion of the original does not apply. Because what Indian or Central Asian text, in what language the Chinese were demonstrably looking at, is practically, in very few cases, clear. And when it is clear what they were looking at, it is still entirely unclear which edition of what they were looking at. It is therefore essential for us to realize that any close study of how this morpheme or that morpheme, this present particle or that present particle, is to be interpreted is beside the point, if only because the editions we have of the texts that are translated, when we do have them, which is not so often, these editions vary, especially with relation to these particles and many features that could be of philosophical interest. So, yes, the Chinese effort in translating Buddhist texts is the greatest effort ever made before the 20th century anywhere in the world. That's a fact. We have not any translation effort of that size, not even in Arabic traditions, to my knowledge. But the translation was in this way not based on the text of Aristotle, the text of Galen, the texts of Porphyry, and so on, which is the case, Proclus, which is the case in the Arabic translations, where you are pretty sure what kind of texts were being looked at, though, of course, never completely. So